I want to thank everybody for coming out tonight. I'm Jeremy Stutzman, Mayor of the City of Goshen. This is actually our second meeting we've had today. We had one a little bit earlier for business owners and property owners that are in the most flooded areas to make sure that they had their opportunity as well to ask direct questions. The City of Goshen staff and I, for several years, have been really working hard with a lot of other agencies and groups and individuals to try and better understand how Goshen floods and why. And so we're just now starting to get a lot of that information compiled. We've had the ability now to work with Christopher Burke and associates, and they've really taken all the information we have and helped us drill down to create a great plan for Goshen. If you've seen the plan, or as we talk about it tonight, just know that we're in the process of going through everything that's in there, and it's still going to take City Council to really kind of go through there and decide which pieces we're going to be pushing forward with and which pieces we'll probably not be doing right away. Some of that will be for money reasons, some of it will be for other reasons, but we are going to try and make the best plan possible. We are learning that it's really tough to fix what's already happening, but it's going to be really, really important that as we move forward in developing our community, that we don't continue to make it worse. And so that's where we're starting, and then we're going to keep making things better as much as possible. We're dealing with issues when it comes to flooding that have been here for decades and decades in the City of Goshen. There are past city leaders, past developers and business owners that made choices at the time to develop in certain areas or to not put in stormwater pieces to help out. In the past, they've chosen not to do those items, and we're dealing with all that now. They didn't know what we're getting into. They didn't know we'd be seeing so much more rain every single year. So we are trying to come together as a community, using every resource we can possibly find to make things better and make sure everybody understands as well what's going on in Goshen. We've got a couple great presentations here, but I want to introduce right now Aaron Kingsley, who is our Director of Environmental Resilience Department. And Aaron and his team are doing some great pieces along with other departments in the City of Goshen. So Aaron, it's all yours.
Thank you to the mayor. Thank you to all of you for coming out tonight. We also hope that there are some folks online joining us. All of us who are doing some speaking are going to do our best to remember to stay on the mic. That's a finger pointed at me especially. Welcome to you all. Mayor Stutzman did a great job of just kind of introducing what it is that we're working on and laying out some of the basics here. We're going to hear more details in just a bit. I wanted to give just a little more background. The historic flooding of 2018, of course, is what looms large in the background for all of us. By late 2020, city staff were ready to try to figure out, to look at our situation, look at our data, and put some sort of a plan together. At that point, we engaged Christopher Burke Engineering, primarily Siavash Beek, who we heard from earlier this afternoon, and Sheila McKinley, who we'll hear from tonight. They have guided us through the process of creating this flood resilience plan, the idea of which is to help us understand what the issues are, what's at stake for us as a community, and what it is that we can do about chronic and increasing flood issues. We'll first hear from our Jason Kaufman and Maddie Lehman with our stormwater department, and then we'll hear from Sheila McKinley from Christopher Burke Engineering. We'll have these presentations, then we'll have an opportunity for some conversation and dialogue, questions and answers from you. That's a really important part of what we want to do tonight. We want to hear from you what you think about the plan that we've created, if you've had a chance to look at it either online or at the public library. I think we've also got hard copies down at City Hall. And we'd like to hear over the next couple weeks from you or anybody else that you may prompt to watch the recording of this presentation or invite to look at the plan. So we'll have question and answer, and at the end of that question and answer, sometime around 7:15, we'll transition back into the lobby area and into the back corner here, where we've got 6 different breakout topics related to the flood resilience plan. Each of these topics are pieces that tie into, are factors that we're considering in this flood resilience plan. You can look at all of these. We'll have staff at each of these topics that you can engage with to ask more questions, more in-depth questions about, what are these factors and how do they contribute, help us to adapt, help us to mitigate the kind of flooding that we experience and that we anticipate. So please stick around and look at the materials that are available. Engage with us that way. Encourage others that you know to engage with us. At some point yet here in the next couple months, we hope to bring the plan to City Council after we've had a chance to digest the comments that we've received and begin to formalize the plan in the capacity that makes sense for us as a community. So with that, I'd like to turn things over to Jason Kaufman and Maddie Lehman. They'll give their presentation, and then they'll turn it over to Sheila McKinley. Thank you very much.
Many of us have memories of the February 2018 flood and how it impacted our area and how it disrupted our daily routines. One of the daily routines that I have is on my way to work, I travel on Plymouth Avenue into the city towards the city offices on 5th Street. However, on the morning of the 21st, which was the morning that the floodwaters had risen, overnight the floodwaters had risen, I found that those floodwaters from the Elkhart River had covered my path to the office. Plymouth Avenue was underwater. So was Indiana Avenue. This has never happened before that I could think of. And so I continued on to Lincoln Avenue, which I found was also closed due to floodwaters. Traveling north on Indiana to Pike Street, I watched numerous vehicles drive through the floodwaters with water up to the bottom of their doors. Not wanting to stall out, I decided to continue on Indiana across the river to Wilden Avenue, where I finally found open roads which allowed me to get to the city offices on 5th Street. What I didn't realize at that time was that the residents of Creekside Mobile Home Park, which you can see here on the right-hand side of the screen, had been evacuated hours earlier in the early morning hours because the floodwaters of Rock were rising from Rock Run Creek. As the sun continued to rise that morning, we realized the circumstances that led to this historic flood, things that we had not understood before. But the things that went into that were frozen ground that water couldn't soak into, a thick snowpack with 1.5 inches of water that had started to melt over the previous week and continued to melt at the beginning of this event, mild air temperatures which allowed for the snow to melt, and approximately 5 inches of rain that fell over 48 hours. All that water coming from this melting snow and from the 5 inches of rain had to flow across the land and into the Elkhart River. The thing is that all that water was flowing across 594 square miles of land before it came through the center of the city of Goshen. That's a lot of water. And the Elkhart River finally crested at 12.53 feet. It inundated 9 major roads and flooded numerous businesses and homes, like you see here. This image is looking east along Lincoln Avenue at Linway Plaza, the Kroger shopping area, and Rogers Park. I draw your attention to where Lincoln Avenue Bridge is at, because this is an important thing to look at when we look at the next image. Because the February 2018 flood, it may have been the worst flood in our recorded history, but it may not have been the worst flood that Goshen has ever had. And I say that because this image is from 1892, a flood that occurred in May of 1892. Lincoln Avenue Bridge is right here. This is looking west from, this image was taken about 3 days, we believe it was taken 3 days after the flood waters crested of this event. And this is taken from the courthouse building looking west. Lincoln Avenue Bridge is here. And the area that is inundated, this is between the Elkhart River and Mill Race and Indiana Avenue. The area that's inundated is where Linway Plaza, where Rogers Park and the Kroger's Area Shopping Center are located today. So the U.S. Department of the Interior installed a river gauge on the Elkhart River near the Indiana Avenue Bridge in September of 1924. This is when we started to record flood events in Goshen. The first event that took place was recorded, the first flood event that took place was recorded in December 14th of 1927, and that river crested at 9.3 feet. Now, since that river gauge was installed, the river has entered flood stage, which is considered 7 feet, and as identified by that yellow line on the graph here, it's happened 79 times. And some of the decades when we had floods, some decades had more floods than others, but it wasn't until the 1980s that we began to see flood events, major flood events above 11 feet. 1982 was the previous highest flood. 1985 was another one, and again in 1990, and then 2018. Each flood is unique, and it's hard to compare to the previous event because conditions change. What time of the year is it? What are the weather conditions around that time? How has the landscape changed, both the natural landscape and the developed landscape? However, we can understand the impact a flood will have and do our best to make sure the economic and social disruptions are minimized. We can do this by protecting our floodplains along the waterways that flow throughout the Elkhart River watershed and also throughout the city of Goshen.
Our flood history is an essential component of understanding our flood future, but we also have increasingly powerful tools that can help us predict and prepare for the next event. Combining our experiences with these tools, we have begun assessing vulnerability in Goshen, which has helped inform the plan under discussion tonight, but is an ongoing process. A couple of the tools and resources we have explored include community-reported data. The Stormwater Department carefully records locations throughout the city where we have received drainage issue reports. We also recently completed a climate change vulnerability assessment for stormwater that explores the sensitivity and adaptive capacity of a number of areas throughout our city as we experience increasing, more severe impacts from climate change. We also consistently monitor that USGS river gauge and utilize some of the USGS's mapping tools to understand what parts of our city are going to flood when. And finally, we have used risk data from the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, which I'll show a few examples of here in a moment. But first, I want to mention that we are asking residents here tonight and watching on the live stream to help us expand our understanding of drainage issues in Goshen by participating in our survey. That survey is asking for comment on the plan, but it also has a mapping function where you can mark an area of concern to you and tell us why that area is of concern. You can find that survey on our flood zone page, that's the link there. And that page has a whole bunch of other resources as well. We've been doing the work to assess vulnerability across the whole city, but we wanted to make sure those tools were in the hands of our residents as well, so that you can assess your own personal risks. You can learn more about the tools at the vulnerability table that Jason and I will be manning after this session, or on that flood zone page. So before we turn things over to Christopher Burke to discuss the components of the plan, we want to highlight quickly some key findings that are vulnerability that we think underscore why we need a plan like this. If you have looked at a floodplain map before, you might have seen the 1% and 0.2% annual chance flood boundary. That's also sometimes referred to as the 100-year or 500-year floodplain boundary. While a map like that is great for understanding risks, these maps do not show the relative risks within those boundaries. We've recently accessed some newly published data from FEMA for our area that helps us better understand the risks at a finer scale. Here we've zoomed in on the Rogers Park, Kroger Area Shopping Center, and Linway Plaza. That called out box at 10% on the right would be where Rogers Park is. In a given year, Rogers Park and other dark red areas on this map have something close to 10% chance of flooding. The orange areas, we're looking at a 3.8% annual chance of flooding, like that called out on the left. And the whiter areas, we're looking at annual chances of flooding near or under 1%, like that called out at the top of this slide. So these data are super helpful, but FEMA takes that one step further that really bring home the risks. Calculating those annual chance risks over 30 years, which is about the length of a typical home mortgage, we can look at those risks through a slightly different lens here. That area where we saw 10% annual chance flooding, that translates to 95.8% chance of experiencing flooding in that area at some point over 30 years. Our 3.8% translates to 69% over 30 years, and our 0.6% translates to 15.5% chance over that 30 years. These data are far from perfect. We cannot with absolute certainty predict flooding, and the factors that contribute to flooding are continuing to change as we have continued development in Goshen and as we experience a changing regional climate. But for now, these are some of the best tools we do have for assessing vulnerability and taking together paint a pretty concerning picture that emphasizes the need for a concentrated effort in Goshen to increase our flood resiliency as we move forward.
Thank you, Maddie, and thank you, Jason. That was a great overview of past flood. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the flood plan itself, flood resilience plan. So let's talk about the planning process. It's an 18-month planning process, and it was led by a 12-member planning team and very dedicated group of people. And I'll give you a list of those names in a minute. We researched past floods in addition to the work that Maddie and Jason did, and also those flood impacts. So where are the areas that are impacted? How much is being impacted? What flood event is affecting what area? We looked at existing policies, programs, and projects, because where we grow and develop as a community really impacts our flooding and our ability to be resilient to that flooding. What stormwater projects have already been done by the city, and what ones are they planning to do, and what benefit would those hold? And then we developed these flood resilience planning areas. These are based on geography of the river itself, proximity to the river and areas that we expect to flood, and then some flood resilience strategies, which we'll go through in detail. We met with the City Council. We were able to have a work session with them. It was a great 3-hour-long meeting, discussion, and really talked through a lot of these issues and tried to answer a lot of their questions. We had a stakeholder meeting earlier today where we talked to business owners, property owners impacted, and then right now with the public. So the next steps are to make some final revisions to the plan, hopefully based on your comments in the next couple weeks, and local adoption, and then the task of implementation. Now, implementation is not going to be easy. These are strategies, as you'll see, these are strategies that maybe some will be fairly simple to implement in 1 to 5 years, but some strategies are going to take 10 or more years to really implement. Like the mayor mentioned, these are historic problems or long-term problems that are going to take a while to resolve. So here's our planning team or our project team that we worked with. Very talented group of people. We were privileged to work with them, very forward-thinking, which was really very refreshing. And I think we did challenge them to think a little bit differently about flood resilience. And so I think we all grew as through this project. I'm going to talk about what is going on with our climate, or things that we're seeing with current climate. So this table here on the left of the screen, this shows sort of the what we can expect rainfall to be, and then the charts, the bar chart shows deviation from that. So you can see that there's a period of time in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, maybe here, that where there wasn't as much rainfall, and that's when a lot of our infrastructure was designed, and those are the storms that it was expected to carry. And you can see in the last 60 years, we've seen a significant amount, greater percentage of rainfall. And so that is certainly challenging our infrastructure that we have. The map here of the United States shows the heaviest 1% of events. These are the biggest rainfall events. And you can see in the Midwest, we've seen a 42% increase of those events. So, and you've certainly experienced that as being someone that is living and breathing and paying attention to the weather. Let's look at Indiana, what we're seeing. So we'll look at this chart in the middle here first. So the trend, as you see, if you drew a line through here, the trend goes on this sort of axis or angle. But what we're seeing in the last 60 years, that it's starting to point upward a little bit more. So that's increased intensity and frequency of rainfall, and we're certainly seeing the impacts of that. And then the Indiana Climate Assessment Report here from Purdue University, it looks at what can we expect in Indiana in 2050. So total annual precipitation, that's expected to increase another 6 to 8%. And when is that rainfall going to come? It's going to come in the winter and the spring. That's the prediction. And so the problem with that is that the ground may be frozen, like the 2018 flood, and the trees won't have leaves on them, so they won't be intercepting the rainfall, and they won't be uptaking as much because they'll be dormant. So that will probably increase flooding there. And the type of precipitation, we expect that we're going to have more rainfall than snow. So look forward to that. This chart here shows the gauge data from the Elkhart River. And over here, hopefully you can see my mouse there. Well, maybe not. So there's the 2018 flood, which has quite a large volume of water. But you can see it's not the first time that you've had this much rainfall. 82 and 85. Maybe you remember those flood events as well. So it's certainly something that seems to be a reoccurring event. So moving forward, there's 3 different ways that we can decide to move forward. We can put together flooding source mitigation strategies, so we can try to capture and control the water at the source and build levees, large reservoirs. But really, if we look at the climate change, what size do we build those to? And how do we know that that's going to be enough to help manage floods in the future? And then at what cost? They're astronomical in cost. And what benefit do you get from that cost? And there's adaptation. So we adapt to what's happening with our climate, and we adopt and implement appropriate resilience strategies so we can learn to live with the flooding that we're having and sort of lessen the pain that it's causing. And the third is always an option, but never a good option, is to do nothing, is to pretend it's not happening and just continue to suffer the consequences of not addressing the flooding. So flood resilience planning is really the ability to prepare for, absorb, recover, and adapt from these flood impacts. And we define these flood resilience areas. They're based on the geography of the river valley, and that defines these. And then it's all about really supporting the natural and beneficial function of the floodplain itself, and really giving room for the river, or leaving room for the river. So the floodplain is probably the best natural infrastructure that we have if we're going to address flooding. The floodplain itself is there for flood storage. The floodway is for conveyance of floodwater. So the more we can stay out of the floodplain and let that absorb the floodwater, the better off we'll be in the long run. So the flood resilience plan is a 2-pronged approach. So the first one looks at land use planning policies to direct growth and development to safer areas. So we know we have this flood hazard area, so let's not continue to build and develop in this area. Let's put people and buildings and businesses, let's put those outside outside of the floodplain, and we avoid the problem altogether. And then, so that prevents the problem from getting any worse, because we're not adding to development in the floodplain. The second part is to identify and implement projects to protect those that are already vulnerable. So those businesses, those buildings, homes that are already in the floodplain, what can we do to help protect them? How can we lessen the pain that they're feeling during a flood event? So before we go on, let's just back up a little bit and get some some terminology that we'll be using throughout the presentation. So first off, we all live in a watershed. So think of it as a giant bowl. The water has to go somewhere. It goes to the bottom of that bowl. That's the river and the river valley. So any land use change that we make in the watershed affects people downstream of that watershed. So if you take a forest and you convert it to a parking lot, then there's going to be more runoff, and that runoff is going to make its way to the river and cause more flooding or impact people elsewhere in the watershed. If we look at in the center here, if we look at the river corridor, there's two key parts to the river corridor. There's the floodway, which is for conveyance, and it's the fastest moving water. We want to make sure that we don't have infrastructure or houses or roads or anything like that in that area, because that's where the water will do the most damage. And then, so that's for conveyance. And then we have the area on the outside of that floodway, and that's the floodway fringe, or the remaining part of the special flood hazard area. And so that's really for storage. So that's a really important area where floodwaters can sit and they can infiltrate, they can recharge our groundwater. Probably the richest habitat is in the floodway fringe area. And there's a lot of different names for the floodplain. Or there's the flood hazard area, there's a special flood hazard area, there's a 100-year floodplain, there's a 1% chance of floodplain, and the regulatory floodplain. So a lot of different ways for this to define this area. And then the other part of it is that streams move. So remember that streams are not static. They are very dynamic, just as part of their nature. So they are going to erode, and they're going to deposit. And so again, we want to make sure that we keep infrastructure and buildings and roads out of this stream movement zone, or a fluvial erosion hazard area. All right, well, we define our flood resilience planning areas. There's the river corridor area. And so that is defined as the floodway or the fluvial erosion hazard area. And so again, that's the area where the river is moving fastest, and certainly an area you want to keep out of. You can see it's a very large blue hatched area, and the city has done a great job of keeping that as much open space as possible. A lot of parks and undeveloped land in that area, and that's great. That's absolutely perfect. The next area is orange in color, and it's the undeveloped part of the floodway, that floodway fringe. And so that's really important to keep open, because, like I said, that's important storage for the floodwater, that natural beneficial function of the floodplain. Remember that natural infrastructure. The really light yellow area is the moderate flood hazard area. So this is the 500-year or the 0.2% annual chance. And so think of this as, with climate change, think of this as tomorrow's floodplain. So we want to try to keep that as open as possible, because that's where we may need storage for future and those really heavy, larger rain events. The red areas are the vulnerable areas. So this is where we have people living or working or businesses in the floodplain. And so what strategies can we put in place to help lessen their pain during a flood? Safer areas, these are outside of the floodplain altogether. This is absolutely the best place to promote growth and development for flood resilience. And then the watershed wide. So what can we do in the watershed? What can we do upstream? What can we partner or coordinate with the Soil and Water Conservation District? What can we do with counties upstream and municipalities upstream? How can we work together so that not as much water is making its way to Goshen? So I just want to talk through these different areas and talk through some of those strategies in particular. So the first one, that river corridor impact area. So the intent, so remember, it's the floodway and the fluvial erosion hazard area. So we want to conserve land and prohibit development in these areas. So we want to adopt a fluvial erosion hazard corridor. We want to make sure that we understand where the river's going to move. These have all been mapped, and we want to make sure that we're keeping infrastructure and buildings outside of this area. And then we want to protect that land as much as possible as an undeveloped state so that there is room for the river to move and that area can naturally flood. The undeveloped high hazard flood storage area, so this is that part of the floodway fringe that is undeveloped, the floodway fringe. And we want to conserve that land and maintain that natural beneficial function of the floodplain. We want to discourage any future development. So we want to maybe work with conservation groups, land trusts, put that land, keep it in open space in perpetuity as much as possible. Forest, agriculture is a great use of it as well. Keep it as open space. And where development is unavoidable, we want to implement compensatory storage. So that means if you lose flood storage because of a development, you want to make sure you're compensating for that same storage or more in that same area. Because we don't want to lose any of that storage, and we want to maintain that natural beneficial function of the floodplain. In that moderate flood hazard area, so this is that 500-year or 0.2% annual chance. So these are areas that may be flooded under extreme events. So we want to try to keep them as open space as much as possible, discourage new development. And where we do have buildings, let's put in some higher standards because that may be tomorrow's floodplain. The vulnerable developed areas, this is where we have people and businesses, homes and businesses that are vulnerable to flooding. What can we do to reduce their pain and suffering? One is prepare a flood response plan. So that is what area is going to flood during what level the river is going to be at, and how do we evacuate those people? How do we get them out? What roads will be closed? What roads will be overtopped? How do we know that information ahead of time, and how do we distribute that information so people can prepare and protect themselves? Preparing a citywide stormwater master plan, that certainly helps understand where the problem areas are and comes up with solutions and costs, and then a long-term timeline to implement those projects. Participating in the National Flood Insurance, the NFIP, their community rating system program. So this is a program where communities that go above and beyond what the national standards are, people who pay flood insurance receive a premium reduction in their flood insurance. So it's a win-win. So we become more flood resilient. We have people getting flood insurance premium reduction. So it works all around. So relocating or buying out structures or retrofitting structures. So we want to focus first on buying out or relocating structures in that river impact area, where the water is moving the fastest, and the conveyance for stormwater or floodwater. And then those properties outside of that, what can we do to retrofit those, buy out those, or relocate those structures? And then where we do have structure or buildings that are non-conforming, so maybe they were built prior to the flood standards, what can we do to help them become conforming? So can we help them elevate their air conditioner, all their electrical outlets on the lower floor of their building? What can we do to help them be a little more resilient to flooding? Because buying out or relocating structures is not always an option. And then safer areas. This is where we plan for and promote development in areas that are less vulnerable to flood risk. So we're going to guide growth and development to these safer areas. We're going to promote conservation design. We're going to use low-impact development and green infrastructure because we're going to capture and treat as much stormwater as we can at the source so that we are not impacting someone downstream with stormwater runoff. And this is where we're going to promote the placement of critical facilities. So hospitals, schools, fire, police, these are all critical by their name that we don't want to have access to limited by floods, or we don't want to have them impacted by a flood. And in the watershed, we're going to promote coordination and partnerships and implement practices to slow spread and infiltrate floodwaters. So the more we can do upstream in the watershed, the better off everyone will be, especially those that are downstream. And the watershed is very large, that is draining to Goshen. So the more you can collaborate and partner with the folks upstream, the better you'll be. And the more you can do, the better folks downstream will be because of what you're doing. So we're going to support USGS stream gauges. We're going to build partnerships within that watershed and support soil and water conservation district programs. So there's quite a bit of farmland in the watershed, and there's a lot that can be done through conservation farming practices to capture, treat, and hold that stormwater. And if there's tillage practices that are occurring, deep tillage, because you can store a lot of water deep in the soil there too. And then tile drains and surface drains. So what can we do to hold back that water so it's not going so quickly from the land to the drainage ditch, to the rivers, and then flooding the floodplains. And then there's some overall strategies that are really citywide. They're not targeted to any particular area, but it's really importance of syncing plans and policies to make sure they're all saying the same message, to make sure your comprehensive plan and your zoning ordinance and your multi-hazard mitigation plan and your capital improvement plan and future growth plan, make sure all of those are really in sync and it'll really to really promote this whole idea of flood resilience. So one plan is not going to solve everything. So updating the stormwater ordinance and make sure that people understand why they're implementing the stormwater ordinance, how much water they're supposed to detain, how do they treat the water, how do they store it. Improve flood risk communication and education. The city does a great job now of getting information out onto the webpage to let you know what gauges to look at and what those gauges mean and what areas will flood. So the more you know about flooding, the more you will protect your property and your person and be a little more flood savvy and reduce that impact. Conducting regular audits of plans, programs, and policies to make sure that they are all in sync so that one plan, like a capital improvement plan, isn't pushing growth and infrastructure into the floodplain, whereas the flood resilience plan is saying, no, it has to be out in a safer area. So just making sure everything is in sync. Integrating flood resilience into the comprehensive plan. That is the important plan that the city puts together, the big vision, and so flood resilience should really be part of that as well. Flood resilience in capital projects, making sure that we're capturing, treating, and storing as much stormwater as we can with these projects and not having so much runoff. And then the multi-hazard mitigation plan, which is a county-wide plan that looks at multiple hazards. So like I said, for implementation, there's a lot of strategies here. Implementation is not going to happen overnight. So some of these strategies are seemingly fairly quick fixes, like 1 to 5 years, but some are going to take multiple years, multiple decades, really to get in place. But like Aaron said, you have to start somewhere, and this is certainly a great place to get started. So I think, Aaron, questions? Do you want to open up for questions now? Okay, and I want to leave it on this slide here so you have the QR code for participating in it's not a quiz, it's in a questionnaire.